I go by the name Daisy, and this year marks my 18th birthday. I reside with my parents in a spacious residence in California. Our family is financially comfortable, never having to fret over money or meals. My father, a robust and brave man, works as a real estate agent, while my mother, a nurturing and gentle teacher, tends to our family with care. Our lives appeared tranquil in our comfortable home, until an unexpected event disrupted everything. It was a dreary afternoon, with ominous clouds gathering as if heralding impending misfortune. My mother and I busied ourselves in the kitchen, preparing our usual dinner, and awaiting my father's return from work. The space felt snug, with the inviting aroma of my mother's soup wafting through the air, providing warmth against the chilly breeze outside. Suddenly, the peaceful ambience shattered when the phone rang abruptly. It was my father on the line. I watched in silence as my mother answered, and within moments, our world turned upside down. My father's voice wavered, starkly contrasting his usual assured tone. He informed us that his company had collapsed, leaving him penniless and necessitating the sale of our home to settle debts. His words struck us like lightning. Our cherished home, where I had grown up, would no longer be ours. I glanced at my mother, who struggled to maintain her composure, though her eyes betrayed her concern. My father instructed us to quickly relocate to the countryside, his voice weary. "Go live with your grandfather, at least there you'll have shelter," he urged. His words left me stunned. My father's birthplace was a place I seldom visited. Since my grandmother's passing, my grandfather had resided alone in an old house. As a child, I recalled my grandfather's playful nature, and how he doted on me. However, it had been so long that his face had faded from my memory. The following morning, we packed and departed our familiar home. My mother and I embarked on the journey alone, as my father had left after delivering the bad news. The scenery transformed as we traveled from towering cityscapes to muddy paths and sprawling fields. A sense of emptiness weighed on my heart. Upon arrival, an aging house came into view. Its roof, weathered by time, and worn walls revealed ancient bricks beneath. Encircling it was a vast garden with lush fruit trees. Exiting the car, I hesitated before the unfamiliar scene. Suddenly, the front door creaked open, revealing my grandfather. Slightly hunched, his deep-set eyes appeared older than I remembered. He smiled warmly at us, especially at me. In my childhood, he showered me with affection, but now his gaze held an indescribable intensity. Gone was the gentleness I once knew, replaced by a deeper, more scrutinizing expression. I dismissed it as the effects of aging. We greeted him, and he warmly welcomed us inside. The interior was modest, yet he had thoughtfully prepared for our arrival, ensuring everything was in place, even arranging a bed for my mother and me. While not as lavish as our previous home, it possessed a distinct warmth. In our early days with my grandfather, life seemed serene. He showed constant care, shared stories, and helped my mother adjust to our new circumstances. As I spent more time with my grandfather, I started noticing an unfamiliar intensity in his gaze. Whether I was brushing my hair in front of the mirror, or enjoying a book in the garden, I often felt his eyes on me. Whenever I turned around, I would catch his mysterious look, quite different from the warm eyes I remembered from my childhood. I wondered if it was my casual city attire that drew his attention. In the city, I was accustomed to wearing light, comfortable clothing. Perhaps my grandfather wasn't used to seeing me like this after so many years. I tried to convince myself that it was merely a clash of urban and rural lifestyles and nothing more. One quiet afternoon, my mother had gone to town, leaving just my grandfather and me at home. I settled onto the well-worn but comfortable old sofa in the living room, engrossed in a book I had recently finished. Soft sunlight streamed through the window, casting a dreamy glow over the room. Absorbed in my reading, I barely noticed the subtle sounds behind me until my grandfather entered, carrying a plate of neatly peeled fruit. The apples, pears, and oranges were arranged attractively. He approached slowly, placed the plate on the table, and smiled warmly. "You should eat some fruit for your health," he said kindly. I looked up, smiled, and thanked him before taking a small bite of an apple and returning to my book, grateful for his thoughtful gesture. Grandpa was always attentive in his caring ways. However, I couldn't help but notice him sitting across from me, his gaze unwavering. Initially, I thought he was simply resting, but the prolonged silence felt awkward. Despite my efforts to focus on my book, his gaze seemed to fill the space between us. Eventually, he broke the silence with a soft comment, "You've grown up so much. It feels like just yesterday I held you as a little girl, and now you're such a beautiful young woman." I lifted my face, attempting a smile as I replied, "Yes, time does fly, Grandpa." My cheeks flushed with warmth, feeling his unfamiliar gaze. His eyes no longer held the warmth and gentleness I remembered, instead, they conveyed something indescribable that made me uneasy. He continued in a contemplative tone, "The older you get, the more you resemble your mother when she was young. Beautiful, yet you have your own unique charm." I smiled slightly, trying to conceal the discomfort his words stirred. "You're too kind, Grandpa." "I'm just ordinary," I said, keeping my eyes on the book, striving to remain composed. Inside, I felt uneasy, unsure how to handle his compliments. He seemed eager to extend the conversation, reminiscing, "I used to carry you around the garden. Do you remember? You would chatter on about everything." I responded with a light smile, despite the awkwardness I felt. "Yes, I remember. Those were fun times, you always spoiled me." His eyes remained fixed on me, his words unsettling, "You're not only beautiful but quite enchanting. The boys must be lining up for you, though I hope you find someone worthy to cherish you." Flustered, I lowered my head, my hands trembling as I nervously flipped through the pages of my book. His remarks left me at a loss. "I'm still young, it's too soon to think about such things," I replied softly, striving to maintain my composure. Grandpa offered a faint smile before standing up. "You're right. I'll leave you to your reading and head out to the garden," he said, departing the room, and leaving me to exhale in relief, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. As he exited, I dared to glance around, the room once again filled with silence. Yet an inexplicable unease lingered within me. The book in my hands seemed irrelevant as my thoughts were consumed by my grandfather's words and gaze. His compliments, though seemingly benign, carried an undercurrent that unsettled me. After that day, my grandfather's demeanor became more perplexing. His gaze lacked the warmth I once knew, replaced by something that made me uneasy. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was overthinking. But every time he was near, anxiety and confusion welled up within me. One morning, my mother had to leave again, assisting my father with city matters. The prospect of being alone with my grandfather filled me with unease. Though reluctant to admit it, I sensed something was amiss. It wasn't just his eyes anymore, his behavior sometimes seemed odd, leaving me puzzled. With my mother gone, the house fell into an eerie quiet. Previously, he would sit in the living room or garden, occasionally glancing at me. But now his proximity felt intrusive, unsettling me further. On the third day of my mother's absence, the afternoon unfolded peacefully. Sunlight filtered through the garden trees, casting dappled patterns on the ground. As usual, I sat beneath the fruit trees with a book, seeking distraction. The garden appeared serene, with birds chirping and a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. Yet, that tranquility only heightened my nervousness, my mind preoccupied with unease about my grandfather. Immersed in my book, I tried to quiet my thoughts when a subtle sound caught my attention, a soft rustling as if footsteps approached on the grass. My heart quickened. Slowly, I turned, and there he was, approaching with unhurried steps, his eyes fixed on me. Anxiety gripped me, and although I longed to escape, I couldn't look away. He drew nearer, stopping mere steps from me. I struggled to remain composed, though tension marked my face. "Grandpa," I called, my voice betraying a slight tremor. He halted, his gaze intense and unfamiliar. His voice was low, "I like you, Lily." I was struck dumb, my mind reeling at his words. He continued, his tone steady yet resolute, "In my life. I've never encountered such beauty," he murmured, his words leaving me paralyzed with confusion. My heart raced as my entire body froze, unable to process the situation. The grandfather I once revered was now uttering words that felt like a sharp blade cutting through my consciousness. Standing there, his unwavering gaze filled with desire, he drew closer, making it hard for me to breathe. "You're a remarkable young woman now," he continued, his voice laden with intensity. My voice caught in my throat, and my feet felt cemented to the ground as a torrent of disordered thoughts swirled in my mind, none offering a way out of this surreal nightmare. After a tense pause, I managed to stammer, You shouldn't say that." Yet he inched nearer, his breath warm against my skin. My heart pounded harder, my feet refusing to move. When he reached out, his skeletal hand gently grasped mine, the roughness of his touch sending shivers through me. "Lily," he whispered, the words heavy and obscure, "I want you to be mine." His grip tightened, and I saw in his eyes not the familiar love of a grandfather but something entirely unexpected. Panic surged through me, and I tried to retract my hand, though my strength faltered. Desperation colored my voice as I pleaded, "Grandpa, you can't. I'm your granddaughter." His expression shifted from longing to shock, tinged with disappointment. "But I've thought about this for so long," he confessed. "You've blossomed into a stunning woman, and I want nothing more than to protect and cherish you." I recoiled, my hand still trembling. "No, Grandpa, we can't. Please stop." A silence descended, his gaze turning somber. Slowly, he released my hand and stepped back, his head bowed in remorse. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. I don't know what came over me," he muttered. With one last regretful glance, he turned and disappeared into the garden's shadows. I remained rooted, heart racing, unable to move or speak. Relief washed over me as he vanished, as though waking from a nightmare. From that moment, I avoided him, fear and uncertainty clouding my actions, unsure whether to confide in my mother. Thankfully, my parents soon returned. My mother entered with a comforting smile, announcing that my father's work was secure, and we could return home. Her words lifted a heavy burden, and my fear subsided, knowing I was no longer alone. My father arrived shortly afterward, his happiness restoring a sense of normalcy. As we prepared to leave my grandfather's house, I felt a bittersweet mix of sorrow and relief. Those days, marked by a shift in my grandfather's demeanor, left an indelible mark, forever altering our relationship. As I settled into the car beside my mother, a sense of safety and gratitude washed over me, thankful that this chapter was closing. As we prepared to leave, I inadvertently met my grandfather's gaze. His eyes were filled with sorrow and depth, as if he wished to communicate something but couldn't find the words. He avoided direct eye contact, maintaining a quiet distance. He stood there, watching silently, and I lacked the courage to confront him after everything that had transpired. A whirlwind of emotions churned within me, fear, anxiety, and a flicker of empathy for him. Despite his wrongdoing, I sensed his remorse. Yet, the tension of those moments lingered, abruptly altering our relationship. Both of us needed time, to process, to heal emotional wounds, and perhaps to mend our fractured bond, if that was even possible. As the engine roared to life, breaking the garden's silence, I glanced back at my grandfather. He remained in the yard, his silver hair ruffled by the breeze, enveloped in solitude. He had endured years of solitude, and now he faced it once more as we drove away, leaving him behind. A pang of guilt and sadness struck me. Despite everything, he was still my grandfather, someone I once cherished and respected. But now, a chasm had formed between us, one neither of us knew how to bridge. As the car moved forward, leaving the old house behind, I turned my gaze ahead, attempting to dispel the chaotic emotions within me. The journey back was silent. My mother, seated beside me, offered a gentle smile and inquired about the past few days, but I responded briefly, then returned to gazing out the window. The passing scenery blurred by, yet my mind remained fixed on the image of my grandfather, standing in the garden, his sad eyes imprinted in my memory. Reflecting on my experience, I urge everyone to uphold boundaries in relationships, even with family. While familial love is vital, respect and personal limits must be prioritized. If something makes you uncomfortable, find the courage to voice it. Silence can complicate matters and cause lasting harm. The key lesson I learned is to trust your instincts and not allow anyone to violate your boundaries. If you feel uneasy, reach out to trusted individuals for support. Always protect yourself and cultivate relationships rooted in mutual respect.